Having become somewhat proficient at board modding, I thought it would be interesting to see how far I could take a budget board without spending a lot of money. Since I primarily use 65% boards, I thought I'd try the Royal Kludge K68. I grabbed the board from Amazon for $50 with brown switches. As you can see, it's a plain white board, a perfect canvas for my experiments. The board works fine, but it looks and sounds kinda cheap. I forgot to do a sound test before I started modding, but I'll put links so you can hear for yourself. Trying to put myself in the shoes of someone on a budget without easy access to a keyboard shop, I set 3 rules. No, 4. Make that 4 rules. 1, I would not replace any of the stock components, only mod them. 2, I would use things I had laying around the house as much as possible. 3, I would spend the absolute minimum on improving the board. And 4, I would not rely on specialty keyboard products. So here's the board deconstructed. At the top, you can see the switches, the screws, and the stabs. Below is the bottom case, the plate, and the PCB. We're going to work on all of these, starting with the keycaps. The caps have very thin walls, feel a bit flimsy, and sound rather clacky. To give them a bit more heft and dampen the sound, I put hot glue down inside the tops. If you do this yourself, make sure you don't go above the struts that run from the stem to the walls. As I found out, even a little extra will cause interference with the switch top housing. It also turns out that hot glue sticks really well to these caps. I had to use a penknife to scrape out the excess. The plate felt really heavy, and I had a feeling it might be steel. Speaker drivers have magnets in them, and sure enough, the plate easily held up this little project speaker I had lying around. As you can see, there are standoffs that stick up from the bottom of the case. The plate rests on these with the PCB hanging down. It's a standard tray mount setup. The steel plate screwed into the standoffs results in a relatively harsh feeling and sounding bottom-out experience. A popular mod for tray mounts is to put O-rings on the standoffs to cushion the plate, but I decided to try something different. See the small pillars running around the edge of the case? The plate rests on these as well as the standoffs. My idea was to hack a kind of gasket mount using rubber bands. I ended up using masking tape to hold them to the plate. Now the plate rests on the rubber bands which rest on those pillars around the case. The plate doesn't even touch the standoffs anymore, so I skipped putting O-rings on them. The result is a more cushioned feel and less transfer of noise from the plate to the case. The PCB was next. I applied 2 currently popular mods, PE foam on the top of the PCB and masking tape on the bottom. The foam was the packing material that another board came in, so it cost me nothing. I poked holes for the large pin on the bottom of each switch with a small screwdriver. I dampened the case with 1/8 inch rubber and felt carpet padding, a material I've used in a lot of my builds because I have a big scrap of it on hand and it seems to work really well. Now it was time for stabs and switches. Following the rules I set for myself, I couldn't use Krytox because it is a specialty product and also relatively expensive. After doing some research and reading a fair number of technical resources, I concluded that Super Lube multi-use synthetic oil would be the best bet. I got a 4-ounce bottle, part 51004, from Amazon for $5. This is enough to lube thousands of switches. I already had some Permatex dielectric grease on hand. A small tube, part 81150, runs about $8 on Amazon and is enough to lube many stab wires. For the stabilizers, I started with my version of the Holy mod, which uses thin strips of thin electrical tape. First, I insert one end of a strip into that opening above the hole for the stab wire. Then I use needle nose tweezers to push the other end of the strip through the stab wire hole. This mod is the only reliable way I've found to stop ticking because it eliminates metal on hard plastic contact. If you do this, be sure to use thin electrical tape. I accidentally used a roll of thicker tape I had laying around and it made the stab sluggish, so I had to go back and fix that. I clipped the extra legs on the stab sliders in the usual way. I lightly lubed the sides of the sliders and dipped the ends of the stab wires in Permatex. I put small pads on the PCB where the sliders lay, and you can of course use band-aids or electrical tape for this. The final functional mod was lubing the switches. I decided to keep things fast and simple. I lubed the springs by dipping the bottom in a puddle of Super Lube. If you do this, make sure you don't end up with a film of lube across the opening of the spring. You don't want to end up getting lube in the hole for the switch stem pole, as it can make the switch sound wet or even cause it to make a weird popping noise. For the stems, I started out lubing the rails, but concluded it was faster to just lube the slots and the bases. Since Super Lube is pretty thin, I didn't worry too much about excess. The switches are never going to be epic, but once lubed, they sound and feel pretty good, all things considered. I also decided to change the aesthetics of the board by painting it. I taped off the thin bezel and primed the case and keycaps with some spray primer I had lying around. I really didn't like the busy legends on the shine-through cap, so I decided to go for a blank look. I only had a few colors of spray paint on hand. Ultimately, I settled on matte nickel for the majority of the keycaps. After a few light coats of paint and a couple coats of matte sealer, they came out looking pretty good, with a lightly textured feel reminiscent of PBT. For the case, spacebar, and escape and return keys, I decided to do something a bit more experimental. I had taken up acrylic pouring as a pandemic hobby, so I got out my paints and I layered the colors into a funnel, intending to do a kind of ring pour, but at the last moment I decided to just do a flip cup. The result came out pretty cool in my opinion. I set the keyboard to dry on some paper cups and dipped the keycaps in the runoff to give them a matching look. I gave the acrylic a week to cure, then I gave it a couple of coats of the matte sealer. I was pleased to note that all the mods work together to give the board a novel aesthetic and a much better sound profile. It is thockier and poppier, not hollow and plasticky. To my ears, it sounds as good as some much more expensive keyboards, and it feels pretty nice to type on. I even used it to type the script for this video. And now, you've listened to me long enough. Let's hear the board. So that's it. I think it turned out pretty cool. Sounds really good for what it is. And I hope you found this interesting, maybe useful. And if you have any other ideas for making cheap boards sound great, I'd love to hear about them. Thanks and take care.